Today I got a few photos and comments on this Monday morning. I hope you guys are going to have a good week this week. And I'm just going to jump right into what I was thinking about. And every now and then something comes to mind that I learned, and I'd like to tell you about it. This Dodge Caravan, we had put a radiator in this thing about a year earlier. And it was a pretty nice vehicle. And maybe about 6 months earlier, what, maybe a year, or maybe it might have been 2 months, I don't remember, but it was weeks earlier, months earlier, whatever, we put a radiator in. And she came and she said, this thing's percolating. I can hear it percolating. And so, you know, whenever it's percolating, you basically go look at the coolant level and other things. And what I noticed when I removed the radiator cap, you notice how right here there is this signature of where this little bump, which is right here, it impacted the rubber seal, and this spring right here is supposed to press that rubber seal down against that lip in the bottom of that radiator. And this was a Chinese made radiator we got from Advanced Auto Parts. And I noticed that the radiator cap was basically not pressing down with enough pressure against that. So I said, well, this is a new radiator cap, and there's really nothing wrong with it. The spacing on the radiator from here to here was off, is what it basically amounted to. And so it wasn't pushing down with enough pressure to hold the coolant under pressure and keep it from doing this percolating that it was doing. Now, I think we may have put it in there when it was cooler weather and it got into the summer, and that's one of the reasons you noticed it was percolating. But that radiator was made in such a way, and you can see how it moved when I did that, so that this was barely touching, if at all. And so just for the sake of argument, I got another radiator cap that had a good seal on it, and I worked it underneath there and made that seal, you know, stacked the seals, worked it in there, so just experimentally. And because I made that seal thicker by putting another seal just like it, you know, I stacked it in there and it pushed it down. And then when I put it on there like that, and, you know, made sure it was full of coolant, all that percolating went away. And I told her, I said, this thing, if we're going to fix this the right way, is going to need another radiator. And of course, I believe that one was still under warranty or something, but she felt like as long as it wasn't percolating with that double gasket that I put on there, she was satisfied with that. But you notice there's a 16 PSI. When you look at that radiator cap, some of them will be, I've seen them as low as 7 pounds, and I've basically seen them 12, 13. They can be any number of poundage, but that depends on the spacing from here to here. Now this is the seal too, and this is the rubber seal, and the spacing from there has got to be enough so that the spring will compress a little bit when you put it in there, and so it will keep that pressure on that coolant. And you know, that sometimes you can overthink and do a whole bunch of other work on one trying to find out why it's overheating, and then it finds out, and then you discover that, well, you know, all it was the spacing on the radiator. And the key to that was when I took the radiator cap off and I looked at it, I didn't see where that rubber had, see how this one here, you can see this one here, that ridge has created a dimple in that rubber, and the heating and cooling and all that, the dimple kind of stayed there. But also you could tell when you took it off, it didn't have any tension much. And so that was, you know, understanding all of that was what led to the fixing of that one. Now this is a dangerous thing. We've all used these pickle forks, most of us have. And if you whack that pickle fork and you whack it and whack it and whack it, you know, they also make the bit to go on an air hammer, which works really well for this. But pickle forks are, you know, something that my son was working at a tire store, and he was holding a pickle fork with a pair of pliers and they were beating on it really hard, and it, you know, it jumped off of there and popped out of the pliers, and that pickle fork, you know, hit him upside the head. So you got to be really careful when you're using a pickle fork. Always wear eye protection too, because at the end of this thing, you know, whenever you're banging on it, a little chip of metal can come off that thing and go in your eyeball. So wear those safety glasses. This looks like a Honda car to me, because it's got this wishbone affair, you know. On these right here, it actually has 2 ball joints, but the wishbone is connected between the strut tower and the lower control arm. And that's a Honda thing, but also some Ford Fusions and some of your Mercurys are set up that way now, and it's really not a bad plan. I kind of like that. But this one here doesn't have a bearing on the top because the steering axis does not go up through the center of the shock. It goes through the ball joint and the upper ball joint. So enough for that. But anyway, they have these little tools here that are supposed to help you take the tie rod ends loose. Now they don't work on a ball joint. They're basically for tie rod ends, and they work okay. But what I always taught my students to do was to whack on the taper, in other words, the part of the taper's through, and get that tie rod end to bounce out of there like that. Now what you don't want to do is you don't want to hit the tie rod end inboard so that you're putting impact pressure against the rack. If you're going to hit the tie rod end, don't hit it so that you're hammering in toward the rack, or you'll ruin the rack. I actually had a student do that one time. He ruined the rack, the steering rack on a car, hitting it so that, and all of that force was traveling through that tie rod into the rack, and it screwed up the rack. So don't hit it in that direction. Hit it in a right angle to the direction of the tie rod's coming out. That way you won't have that problem. And those things are kind of like when you're pulling the steering wheel off of some cars. You pull and pull and pull and rock it back and forth, and finally when you're about to give up on it, it pops off of there. That's just like that. You can beat it and beat it and beat it, like you saw me doing whenever I was pulling those brake rotors off of the rear of the Explorer the other day when I was putting those. You hammer it and hammer it and hammer it and hammer it, and finally it pops off of there. Okay, so this right here is a steering column repair. What we used to have to do on some of the Fords. This is the shift part of it, shift rail part of the steering column. And what would happen there is that we would have people, whenever the stoplight wire would, after mashing the brakes and bending it, the stoplight wire would break. And then whenever they would go to mash the brake to pull it out of park, it would not come out of park, and so they'd just figure, well, I'll just force this thing out of park, and they would break this little tube right here. And I don't know how many times I had to replace those things because somebody just got rough with them. That tube rides in this little saddle right here, is what it does. But another problem we used to have with these was the little rack part of the the rack part of the ignition switch assembly, where you've got the ignition switch. The lock cylinder's got a gear on the bottom, and it operates the rack, and that goes down, and it actually operates the ignition switch. Well, what people would do is they'd have this little metal rod that would come out of that plastic rack, and all of a sudden your key would just flop around and it wouldn't start the car, or it would come out of there and you couldn't turn the car off, that kind of thing. And of course you got to be careful with your clock spring, because that's a problem there. If you don't time that clock spring right when you're putting it back together, you'll destroy the clock spring, and that's never a good plan. But there was quite a few little operations we used to have to do with them steering column assemblies. But that's neither here nor there. This right here, this F-150 busted a ball joint. When the guy was slowing down to turn in, that ball joint gave way, and of course, that's a violent kind of a thing because the wheel pops out and the truck drives to drop down and all that kind of thing. And it just, typically when something like this fails, usually it'll be when you're turning. Not when you're driving down the road, not usually, but when you're turning. Now, I have seen a tie rod end come apart on a truck I was driving behind, and that thing was all over the road. The wheel that the tie rod end came apart on was shopping cart wobbling all over the place, and he was all over the road this way and that, and he went into the left lane and back in over onto the shoulder, and finally got the thing to stop. But it was a total loss of steering control, or I say just about a total loss. He did manage to get it out of road. This one here, you notice when it popped out of there, it jerked the CV joint apart. This is a four-wheel drive, and so what we had to do, I got out there because she had it towed in and put off out in the parking lot. We did not have a good way to move this, so I had to get out here and fix the thing in the parking lot, and drag an air hose out there and all that kind of thing. And so that was it's sort of a mess when, I wish I could be one of those people that lays all my tools in perfect order and has everything just like it's supposed to be the whole time I'm doing a job. That's really nice when you're taking a picture in it. But I have a tendency to just reach and grab and throw stuff around and do whatever I have to do to get it done. But this particular truck here had to have that. And the boy was, he was a teenage boy. He was traumatized enough by this ball joint failure that he never wanted to drive this truck again. He was just totally afraid of it. But anyway. Now, smoke testing is a good way to find exhaust leaks, and it's a good way to find intake leaks, and it's a good way to find evaporative leaks. But you got a really bright light to see where the smoke's coming from, and that's basically what we were doing here. Now, these exhaust leaks are really important. And I was watching one of those documentary shows on one of the streaming channels, and there was this guy that was a sort of a decent, sort of a normal kind of a guy, and he started acting kind of crazy and having a bad temper and threatening people, and one day he just drove away, and nobody saw him for a long time. Finally, they found his car sitting beside the road, and then they found his body out there in the desert where he had got out of his vehicle and he had walked about 200 or 300 yards, and he just fell down out there and he laid there until he died. Well, the end of that investigation was that his ratty little car, whatever kind it was, a little small car, I don't remember if it was Asian or American, had a bunch of exhaust leaks that he never got anything done about, and the car was not, airtight enough to keep that carbon monoxide out of the car. And so he had developed a case of carbon monoxide poisoning that had caused him to totally lose his mind a little at the time, and that's why his personality changed at work and all that. Exhaust leaks are a really serious thing that need to be fixed. Some customers might not want to fool with it. It might be aggravating, but whenever you've got an exhaust leak like the one that when we put the smoke into the back of the exhaust pipe, turn on the smoke machine, let it fill all that up, and you see smoke boiling out like this, some of that exhaust is subject to make it into the car, and this is upstream from the catalytic converter, and so they're subject to be carbon monoxide and all that kind of thing going in there. But anyway, we found lots of intake leaks. We used to just use mirrors to find out what was wrong with some of these vehicles when we were trying to look down in there, a light in a mirror. Now we use smoke in mirrors, like magicians and all. Now this right here this is an old 98 model F-150 we're putting a motor in. And the story behind this, that guy that's closest to you, the Army had him, his name is Willie. He's a little older than me, Vietnam veteran, and he was just, taking the course, just so he could learn how to work on his own stuff, basically. He was one of the most reliable people that I had working in the department at the time. I always wound up with one or two that I could really depend on, and he was really solid. And when he put this motor in this truck, what happened was it was the one that was developed a problem with it was skipping on number 5, if I remember right, and it turned out that it had a burnt valve, and I said, well, let's just go ahead and get a motor put in it, because ain't no use in pulling this thing apart and working on it, and you'll spend less money buying an engine for it than you will taking it apart and getting the head reworked and all that kind of stuff. Besides that, these cylinder heads on these modular Ford engines are machined to aircraft specifications, but anyhow, the whole point is he put a motor in there, and it turned out that when he put it in there, it didn't have any compression. And what I figured out was whoever it was that unbolted the torque converter when they were taking the motor out of the salvage yard vehicle had turned the engine backwards and caused it to jump time. And so they sent us another motor, and he had to change that motor 2 times. And that, so we weren't charging any labor. He wasn't getting paid any labor. He changed the motor in half the time, the second time that he did the first time. But this was that motor right there, and it was kind of a tight fit working it in there, But a lot of times it works better if you can to go ahead and take some of the radiator support and all that out of the way if you can unbolt it and get it out of there. And This is a lunch place where I used to eat every day. I love this place. It was built back in 2003, and it really got popular. It would seat like 144 people. They had all kinds of home cooking there and everything, and ice cream and whatnot. And it was just a wonderful place to eat. Well, about 2 years ago, it caught fire and burned down. You know, so, and the old farmer that built it, he was also a veterinarian. He was saying that he wasn't going to go back and do that again. 20 years he had in it nearly before it went up in smoke. But what was funny, and this is a sort of a funny non-automotive story, we were talking to him about what you have to do to a piece of land if you're going to raise cattle on it. And he says, my brother has got some cows across the road over there from where I have my cows, and his cows look like they're starving to death, but mine are so fat they can't hardly wiggle. And he said, what my brother doesn't realize is you're supposed to savage the land and get it ready to put cows on before you ever put the cows in there. And we didn't ask him what savage the land meant, but my lunch partner was the IT guy at the college. And he says, I'm going to look that up. I've never heard of savage the land. I don't know what that means. And so the next day on the way back to lunch, I said, did you find out what savage the land meant? And he says, don't ever do an internet search for savage the land, or you will see a lot of stuff that you never wanted to see. Anyway, I thought that was plumb funny. But now I was behind this vehicle at a traffic light, and I was thinking, why did this driver not see this in the rearview mirror? They either didn't see it, which means they're not very observant, or they saw it, but they didn't want to take a chance of getting out in traffic to put the gas cap on and close the lid. I don't know how long they drove around like this, but when you see something like this, it makes you want to get out and fix that for them, you know. But anyway, that was just a little interesting thing I picked up on. Now, this was an annoying customer in her junky Jeep. She said her nephew borrowed it, and he kept it for weeks. And by the time he finally got it back, the transmission, he said, had been slipping, and he also said the motor was burned up. And she said it was just like brand new whenever he took it. And so she wanted it fixed, and she qualified to have work done somehow or another. I don't know how. But I told her, I said, you don't want to spend all this money putting an engine and a transmission in this Jeep. It's just not good. I mean, somebody needs to buy this and work on it at home or something, because it's going to be kind of pricey. And just because you put an engine and a transmission in the vehicle, it's not going to make it like a new vehicle. I mean, that's just all there is to it. And so what we did was, she would not take no for an answer. She basically wanted this thing done, and so she okayed, I think an engine and a transmission together were like $3,000 or something like that. And what a lot of people don't know is you can put a $3,000 engine in a vehicle and wind up with a $1,200 vehicle when you're done with it. You're not going to get back dollar for dollar what you spent on the engine. When I was working at that shop here in town back in 1977, there was a guy that had a 66 Thunderbird that he wanted us to put a motor in it. And he spent $1,500 putting a motor in it. And when he got through, he still had a $200 car. And he didn't understand that. But like I say, you won't get dollar for dollar back. You're going to have to drive it out of it. Anyway, this lady right here, when we got the motor and transmission put in there, we got that running like it was supposed to. But the thing still had all the other trouble the guy had given it when he trashed it. Some of the windows were broke out and all that. And she was just really totally unhappy with us because this thing did not come out of here. When you put a new engine and transmission in it, the rest of it still has problems. So you didn't really solve anything, you see. All right. Now, this is one of the things I told my students when we're checking these ABS and you're looking at the circuits that, all the wires that plug into, all the harness that plug into like the ABS sensor or whatever, the AC compressor, and you want to check from one end to that other. Don't cram the voltmeter probes into those terminals and mess up the terminals. Well, lo and behold, they did it anyway. That's how they roll, All right, so had to replace that pigtail. Now this is what the scroll failure looks like on this car right here. You notice how the low side pressure is really high, The high side pressure is not terribly bad, but that son of a gun had really awful, and see, look at that, got 86 degrees coming out of the register there, and this is the compressor off of that car. It just come all to pieces. Those scroll compressors don't draw as much power off the engine as the old piston type compressors, but they don't last as long either, so I don't really like those scroll compressors that much. Now this right here was a camber adjustment bolt that I ordered. It was supposed to work on this particular vehicle, whatever it was. And so I took it out of the pack, and the little chamfered down, egged area wasn't wide enough to go in. It should have been way out here, in other words, and then it would have worked. But this was absolutely useless. I don't know who came up with this or who made it or who didn't measure right when they sold it or anything like that, but I had to send that thing back. I don't remember how we wound up dealing with that. We probably got a different camber adjustment bolt that would go. Sometimes when you're doing an alignment, you can either egg shape the holes in the struts, and some of them come with egg shaped holes. If they don't, you can also get these offset camber bolts and all that, and you can turn it and set the camber by turning the bolt, which works pretty good, but you've only got a limited amount of adjustment there anyway. Now this right here was a rear end bearing job. One of the vice presidents of the college, his daughter had an Explorer, and it was making racket, and we got our chassis here, and we heard a lot of noise coming from the rear end chunk. So we pulled the rear end chunk apart, and we replaced all the bearings in it. This was the kit that they send you. They even send you new bolts to bolt the ring gear to the carrier, and we got all of those bearings changed out. We got it all set up. We got the clear, the pinion depth and the backlash set and all that, and painted the gears and had a really good pattern on those and all that. Well, that noise was gone, but the noise, they were still noise, and we got to listen some more, and we actually could see that the bearings in this thing had brindled and all that. So we still had a noise. The noise wasn't quite as bad, but those bearings in the spindles, like I changed on my Explorer, they had gone bad too. And so here we were with bad bearings in both places. And there's a CV axle connecting that chunk to those outer. They're not swimming in the same oil. I don't know why all of those bearings went bad like they did, but they did. Anyway, that was a grand adventure. Now this, you got to be careful about this illegal wiretaping. Spell check didn't catch this in the paper. I showed this to some of my other mechanic buddies. It's kind of funny how something gets in print and it's that big, and somebody can't just glance at that before it ever goes into print and see that it should have TAPPING instead of TAPING. Anyway, that right there, if you're illegally taping wires, you may run into a problem there. So that's just a little neither here nor there. Now this catastrophic rear end failure, this was one of my graduates, and he was driving this Mustang. He might have been going a little fast, I don't know, but this little bolt, that holds that pinion. See, there's your pinion. There's the bolt that holds it into the carrier. This bolt came out, and like I got it pictured right here. And when it came out, this started sliding out of there, and whenever this slid out of there and it made contact with the differential housing, or the chunk, the differential is only the gears in the middle. This is the differential, but see, the rear end also has a ring gear and a pinion in there, and so anytime somebody's talking about the differential, they're only talking about part of what's in this housing. One way or another, this caused him to lose control and go tumbling end over end and back and forth and up and down out through a field. It didn't hurt him. I guess he was wearing a seatbelt, but this is what the Mustang looked like when he got it up on the trailer. And he got another Mustang that had a blown engine and swapped it out. This guy right here was one of the fastest, strongest mechanics that I trained, and he was very sharp. He went to work for a really successful shop over there, where the guy that ran the shop was trying to do too much at once. And the guy that ran the shop should have been working in the office and doing all that work in there, but he was trying to work in the shop and the office. And he put an engine in a Trailblazer. I think it was a Trailblazer. And got it all. It was a used engine. He put it in there, and it was started knocking within about 20 minutes of me putting it in there, making racket. And so this graduate of mine was noticing what was going on and said, "Did you replace the oil cooler?" And he said, "Oh, it has an oil cooler?" And he says, "Well, I'm going to go ahead and let you change the engine. I'm going to pay you to change it out." And I think it paid 8 hours to change that engine out. And this boy that owned this Mustang here, and he wasn't but like 19 or 20 years old. He did it in about 4 hours. I mean, he's really fast and strong, and he can really swing a hammer too. I noticed whenever somebody is beating on something that wouldn't come off, if you gave him the hammer or whatever, he would hit it about 3 times and it would move. Now this is the Bantam Combat Car. This was the first original Jeep. It was made by the Bantam Car Company, and this was the one that the Army decided to go with going into World War II. But the Army quartermasters gave the plans for this combat car to Ford and let them build it. And of course, everybody wound up building it eventually. But this Bantam Car Company, that was the first original Jeep. There were several different versions of it. These headlights didn't always look like this on all the prototypes you see, but it was 4-wheel drive. And the cool part was you didn't have to get out and lock the hubs. It basically had a sleeve that slid and connected the inner axle of the outer one, kind of like some of your pickups and stuff have more recently and all that. Now this was Preston Tucker's Tiger. There's actually videos where you can see this thing in action, and you can see them making all those sales pitch. This thing would go 114 miles an hour, and it was 4-wheel drive. The body is arc welded, no bolts. It's air conditioned. The windows are bulletproof. Of course, when you're shooting bulletproof windows, it kind of spider webs, cracks them where you can't see out of them, and you could change out the windows really fast. That's just an amazing car. And in this little article right here, it said it had this turret on the top, which the Army didn't buy the combat car because they said they didn't need something that would go 114 miles an hour. This was supposed to be an anti-aircraft vehicle. What it would do is whenever planes were coming over, they would take off after the plane, following it, trying to keep it within range, and they would be firing their 4 guns at it, and it would shoot 5,220 shots per minute. They had an automatic 37mm cannon firing 120 shots a minute and 3 machine guns firing 5,100 shots per minute. You can imagine how that must have worked out. Well, they took this gun turret that he had designed, and they put it on some of the bombers and stuff. You'll see it on the bombers, these turrets with the 2 guns in them and all that kind of thing. That's where that came from. Sometimes you just got to take a picture, and this was one of those times. This is an absolutely beautiful car. Perfectly restored, got just enough hot rod about it to where it makes you say, man, that is the way things used to be. That's a 67 model. You can see it on the tag. And see, he's got the tires a little bigger on the back. It's beautiful way of, this was at Walmart, and it was parked a long way from any other cars because he didn't want to get it scratched up, I guess. But I pulled around out there and got my camera out and took a picture of it. I love this car. This right here is the wonderful Chrysler 2.7 liter. I had written some articles about this when I was writing for Motor Age, and people would send me emails and say, I just wanted to cry every time one of these came into the shop to have any major work done on it. Now the interesting part about this, the Ford Flex has got a water pump that's driven by the timing chain, but the problem with those is when the water pump goes bad, it fills the crankcase up with coolant, which is dumb. I mean, I drive Fords, but come on, Ford, you know how to do better than this. Chrysler, when they put this thing together, when this water pump would start to leak, they had it fixed so that it had a choice of 2 weep holes. The thermostat is down here in the side of the engine block, and right up in the side of that block, there's a weep hole for the water pump that drips out of the block, and it's right behind where the thermostat is, and the air conditioner compressor and all that. If that one clogs up with mud, it had an alternative weep hole that would go down this valley between the heads and run out the back, and it would dribble from the transmission bell housing area. So if you see one of these, and also not pictured right here, is that plastic housing that goes right about here that's for your upper radiator hose and all. Those housings like to leak and all that stuff too, so be careful with those. Anyway, but to put a water pump on one of these, you've got all of this. There's your timing marks in case you need to know where they are, and down here, anyway, it's always been an interesting design to me. And that engine's not that bad, really. They're pretty solid. And some of them are, in some of the cars they were in there north-south, and in some of them they were in there sideways. Sebring convertibles typically had a 2.7 in them like this. And the motor runs really good when it's running. It's a real solid engine, but like I say, if you ever had to put a water pump in it, you just about have to pull the engine out and put the water pump in. This is a drag. And so anyway, here we go on that. This T-Bucket Roadster reminded me of a drag race I saw. There was a guy that I knew in high school, and he was skipping school one day, and he was driving through a town over here, and he saw a T-Bucket Roadster that was very similar to this, except the T-Bucket was painted red, and it had what looked like a beer keg back there for a fuel tank. And of course the engine was just like you see this one here, and it had these, as if the headers weren't chrome on his, they were painted white, and it had these thrush mufflers on there. And he would go out there, and across from the church there was a helicopter pad that had a big asphalt pad on it. And he would go out there and he would take these mufflers off, so he would have just a free breathing engine. And it had a 2-speed automatic transmission in it, one of the old Chevy GM ones. And he would get out there and he would spin the tires on that thing just horsing around. And I ain't kidding you, the smoke you in the Hot Rod magazine, how you see the smoke go all the way around the tire and then boil out the side and come back here. That's exactly what it looked like. It was just totally amazing what that thing would do. And so he sold it to one of my other friends, and my other friend was really excited about that. And he wound up buying himself, the guy that originally bought this T-Bucket Road. He paid $600 for it. And the guy was some sort of a drag racing dude, and he'd put one of his drag racing engines in it or something. It was a 350, all hopped up. But anyhow, so this friend number 2 bought it from friend number 1. Friend number 1 bought himself a almost brand new 72 GTO, and this was back in those days. And there was a lonely road out there that was kind of long and straight out in the country where people like to race. And so they lined up with one another, and my friend number 2 was driving it. They're gonna race the GTO against it. Well, the GTO just had plain old tires on it, didn't have any traction bars, and it's just gonna spin the tires and all. This thing here had traction bars and all, and boy, it would really jump off the line. So the guy that was driving the T-Bucket Roadster ran off and left the GTO, but for some reason that nobody's been able to explain even now, he wound up going over into the GTO's lane and just hitting the brakes, and that GTO plowed into the back of him. Now one guy came out and it skinned him up pretty bad, and the guy that was driving, he didn't come out of there, but I used to joke with him that he probably had the letters GTO tattooed on his backside because he was hit so hard in the back with that thing. But he didn't own that thing but about 2 or 3 weeks before that accident happened. But that kind of turned me off on street racing and back road dirt, racing and all that stuff. I wasn't but 15 years old when I watched that happen out there that night. It was sort of a trauma. Didn't kill anybody, but it could have. One guy wound up spending a week in the hospital because he came out of the vehicle and he got scratched all up, his skin all up on the pavement and everything, and they had to keep the scabs off of that so it wouldn't scar him up and everything. That was really a night that I won't ever forget. Anyway, now this messed up Corvette was at Chick-fil-A, and you can tell it's not that old. I don't know where it came from. I'd never seen it before or since. But have you ever been behind a vehicle when you know they've defeated the emission controls, removed the catalysts, and done everything they could to just mess all of the stuff up that was supposed to make clean air come out of the exhaust? This thing was burning my eyes like it was a 64 Chevrolet pickup, that wasn't tuned good. And it was, you could just smell the raw exhaust coming. I didn't see any smoke, but you could smell it and tell that all the emission controls had been defeated on it. And I was thinking, I don't know why somebody would do that. I had this one friend of mine that bought a brand spanking new, let's see, I think it was a '86 Ford pickup. And he was one of the shop foremen at the Ford place. There was a young shop foreman, older shop foreman. And as soon as he bought that pickup, he went straight over to the muffler shop and had the entire exhaust system jerked off their catalytic converters and all, and he had it reworked to have some kind of a ridiculous loud exhaust. And I don't care nothing about doing that with any of my vehicles. I kind of want it to be factory. I mean, in my earlier days, I'd probably put some headers on one or something like that before they had catalytic converters. But anyway, one way or another, that sometimes people. This one guy had a Mustang that he had put a different throttle body. It was a brand new vehicle, different throttle body, different injectors. He had changed everything he could on there, trying to make it his own ride, and he had check engine light. And when I opened the hood and saw all that stuff, I said, I can't do anything about this check engine light unless you put all the original parts back on it. Besides, it's under warranty anyway, and we're not going to be able to fix this under warranty since you've totally modified everything. And if it's your vehicle and you want to modify it, that's fine, but you better know how to fix it yourself if something goes wrong with it. Don't take it to somebody else and fix it after you've messed it all up, unless they can put it back like it was supposed to be. Well, that's pretty much winds up this little video. We've been here for about 35 minutes, and I hope you lasted till the end. And I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I'll see you next time around. Be careful out there.